Hello all and welcome. I'm Jesse Trussell, a film programmer here at BAM. We are so excited to have Éric Baudelaire here with us, whose new work, Un Film Dramatique, is currently playing in our virtual cinema. A big thanks to our partners at Cinema Guild for helping this all to come together. This is a film we saw some time ago and have been keen to bring to BAM ever since. Its thoughtful, intellectual look at the lives of a group of French teenagers touches on the most important issues of our time, but with that light touch and a frequently playful style. It couldn't be more suited to the cinema we want to champion here. Éric, thank you so much for joining us today. So I wonder if we could start quickly by just...
Oh, sorry, I just wanted to say hello and say I'm very happy to join you.
No, thank you. So I wonder if we could start quickly by just talking about the origins of the project. It was a commission by the middle school itself. Is that correct?
Yeah, so initially in France we have this practice where when the state commissions a new building, when a new public building is built, rather, there's a 1% of the building or the construction budget that's devoted to an arts commission. So traditionally, you usually find sculptures or sort of large mural commissions, but and this may have been the first time that a non-material work was commissioned as part of a physical building. They were building, I think, 13 new schools and middle schools in this region, which is the northern suburb of Paris, which would be, I guess in New York terms, it would be sort of like a closest thing to what you call an inner city neighborhood, even though this is an outer city neighborhood. The suburbs in France work kind of the opposite as they do in the United States. The gentrification is very intense, or in the center, and then the further out you go, the poorer the neighborhoods are. So this would be the equivalent, I guess, of a neighborhood in the Bronx or in East New York. And when they built this middle school, they asked me to make a proposal for a commission, and I proposed to shoot a film there. And so I told them that I would spend 4 years in the school, and I would work with a group of volunteer students, and we would start out by making a film that was about these students, and it would gradually become a film that was made with the students, and then eventually, hopefully, 4 years on, it would be a film made by the students. So there would be this sort of transmission of authorship over the course of the fabrication of the film. So initially, it started out as this public commission, and then 2 years in, I think I'd spent all the budget for the 4 years. And so we brought in other partners and other, including, I think for the first time in my experience, a public television station also participated in, and then we were able to pursue the project in a more ambitious manner. Mm-hmm. And let me just close the window, hold on. Here we go.
Thank you. I was wondering, was there sort of a casting process within the school? How did you come? I mean, obviously the sort of film club element naturally lends itself, but was that something you always had thought about, or were you looking at other kids within the school?
Well, there was no film club, so to speak. I don't think, we don't really have clubs the way American schools have. There's the French educational model is that you drop an enormous amount of work on students that keeps them busy from 9 in the morning until 5 or 6 in the afternoon, and you have no extracurricular activities. There's no energy left for clubs or anything of that nature. It's a very different educational model we do here. But in any event, so no, there was no casting, so to speak. I think what happened is we came in and we made an announcement at the end of on the day when the families were visiting the school, when kids were finishing the 5th grade. We announced that we would be doing this film project the following year. So I guess they thought about it over the summer. And then on the first day of school, we made an announcement, like a public announcement that I would be there with my crew, and that if anybody wanted to find out about the project, they should come and we would talk about it. And about 25 kids came up. And at first, so we had this idea that we were going to have to make a selection. So we asked them to fill out, a little application form that was, 2 or 3 questions on a piece of paper. But mostly what I asked them to do is to commit to something, which was to say, this is 4 years. It's a very long time. When you're 11, 4 years is what, like half of your conscious life. I mean, it's a big chunk of time. And so I asked them to try to project themselves into the idea that we would be spending all this time together and to commit to it, almost like a contract that we would make to each other. And then, you know, we reviewed all the applications and there was no way to make a selection. You know, initially I was intending to only work with maybe 12 or 15 students so that it would be smaller and intimate. But when we had the 25 applications, there was no way we were going to exclude anybody. So we just said, you know, congratulations, you all made the program, and started working, and there were about 25. And then a couple kids dropped out, I think, in the first few months when they realized we weren't making like Spielberg type movies. And then a couple kids moved away, and one of them we were able to keep in the project remotely. But at the end, I think there was 21 of us left, 21 of them left. And then we worked with who we had. You know, I don't think there was, that's why I said there was no real application or casting process, because it was really, you know, come who wants to join and we will make the film with the conditions that we have. That was very much a leitmotif of the entire process.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your working methods with the kids, what a daily shoot was like. Did you have ground rules of what would be on or off camera, just the sort of process?
I think, you know, maybe this film is different from some of my previous works in many different ways, but I would say perhaps the most salient difference is that I wanted to try to make this film with as little preparation as possible and with as little planning as possible. In other words, you know, I mean, because of its expense and because time is so rare, process of making films is a very structured and a very determined process. You always have to know what you're going to do. You know, you have to know when you're doing it, with whom you're doing it, how much it's going to cost, and frequently, because you're working with difficult financing circumstances, you also have to always announce in advance what it is that you're going to do. It either takes the form of a script in the case of a fiction, and in a documentary context, you usually have to sort of explain the hell out of what it is that you're going to be shooting. Because of the nature of this commission, which is it's an open-ended artistic commission, they really were okay with the idea that I kept this very open-ended. And so I said very little, which was, I will make a film with the volunteers and the subject of the film will be the making of the film. That's really all I announced. So there was no agenda and there was very little of a plan. The other thing I was very intent upon was I wasn't coming there to teach, I wasn't there to instruct, and I wasn't there to overly structure. I was there to see what happens in as much of a flat hierarchical structure and as much of a, you know, give as much room to self-teaching as possible. Because, you know, I didn't learn film, I didn't go to film school, I didn't go to art school. I mean, my films are the method in which I learned how to make films. So the films themselves have always been grounds of learning. And I wanted to do this as well with them, with the difference that they were 11 at the time. When I was much older, I think I was 30 when I made my first film. So what happens if you self-learn how to make a film at age 11? And that's what fascinated me. And so, of course, there's some structure, you know. We showed up at a certain time every 2 weeks. We had a room for us to work in. The school was very generous with providing us with context, with some teachers, 2 teachers that were very often with us, a literature teacher and the arts teacher. And we would generally start each session with one very simple idea that I would try to not think about until, you know, the car ride to the school. We sort of had this idea that I would plan nothing until literally a few minutes before we'd walk into the building. And that could be a simple thing. And a thing could be, okay, today we're going to start by asking one question, or by, say, placing a small camera in the middle of the room, you know, one of the little video cameras, the first time we revealed the camera. And so when the first kids sort of run into the space, as they do every time, you know, somebody picks up the camera from the floor, flicks it open, starts playing around with it, and that would be the beginning of that session. Or, you know, occasionally I would bring things with me. I brought a friend who's an actor once, and he was sitting in a corner pretending to sleep. And when the kids came in, he just started behaving in this somewhat irrational way, and it triggered the situation that they started playing with. So, but they would be very sort of, I think of these as sort of a simple stimulus for something to occur. So my function in the film was really as somebody who would maybe throw a spark onto the kindle wood, or whatever metaphor you want to use, and sort of see what happens. But I would just provide that spark. And then I would try to, when I see things that I find to be interesting, I would try to nurture that situation, rather, because 11 or 12-year-olds are have short attention span, and you can go from one question to another, one activity to another very fast. So I think my job was really to sort of protect the moments where something that I found very interesting was happening, feed that moment by, maybe asking a few questions, or maybe stimulating that situation, or, making sure that Fatimata or Guyanis is participating in the process and asking somebody what they think. But it was very much about sort of nurturing a situation, but the situation itself was in their hands. Then my crew is there, and I'm instructing them at times, although these are people I've worked with for years, so they we think without necessarily having to speak to each other, but making sure that the keeping an eye on what's being filmed, and maybe listening to my crew for their ideas that they might have, and then trusting instinctively that certain things occur when certain situations are put in place. So, one of these situations is David and Guyanis obviously like to have conversations with each other. I know the nature of their conversations, and I know how this can become interesting, so I can stimulate that in a way. And so these are, and then over the course of 4 years, you learn a lot about each other. And I think the group experience and the experience of the group nourishes the process itself.
I wonder, at the beginning of the process, how would you describe the kids' relationship to cameras? We think of Generation Z as being so, sort of fluent in these digital video making spaces. I don't know if that's necessarily also true of France. What was their relationship to, filmmaking at that level at the beginning, and perhaps how did that mature as it went along?
Well, we have to remember that it started in 2015, so there wasn't as much of a prevalence of the camera on phones, for example, and also because of the socioeconomics of the group. Kids didn't have smartphones in 2015, so I think that it was slightly less prevalent. 6 years ago, 6 years ago. They were comfortable with the idea of being filmed, and they were comfortable with the idea of filming, but they did not. This was a big surprise for me. This is one of the things I learned very quickly. I was very surprised by, is that I had assumed, as you just phrased it, that they're part of a generation for whom filming with their cameras is something they do all the time, or people do around them, and it's very natural. But what I was proposing that they do was completely different for them, what they are used to doing, which is they're used to filming with a phone vertically with the camera turned towards them. And what I was proposing that we do is to use a slightly bigger object, which would be a little Sony camcorder, which is held differently, that provides a horizontal image turned not towards yourself, but towards the world, with instructions. You can call them instructions, go home, film stuff, that were very different than make a selfie or film yourself, or upload something to Snapchat. And these very simple differences, I think cognitively brought the whole project in a completely different brain space for them. I don't think they were associating these two activities as one and the same thing. In other words, the Snapchat video, or the what they'd be doing today would be like a TikTok video. It's a completely different exercise. It's almost as if I was asking, a group of kids 50 years ago to write a poem, to write, an essay about something that's very specific to their lives. It's a different part of the brain that is at work. And so I think that their familiarity with like the lens is a very relative question. And I think that very quickly what they were filming is not what we assume that they're comfortable filming and that they film. They were inventing ideas of what they wanted to film. When Fatimata films herself making spaghetti for half an hour, it's a very different way of filming than when she's on Snapchat and she's talking to a different audience. She's not doing the same thing at all, in a way. And this is sort of a joke with my editor, Claire Atherton, because when we saw Fatimata, Claire edited the films of Chantal Akerman for 25 years, and Claire was supposed to be here tonight, but she had an unexpected change of plans. But when we were looking at Fatimata's images with Claire, we were thinking, she's a direct descendant of Chantal Akerman. She doesn't know it yet because she hasn't seen any Chantal Akerman films, but she is absolutely working in that tradition. Durational, frontal images of her, domestic life, what's happening in the household, and this is great because it's not something we had talked or planned or even discussed, but it's a spontaneous generation of images that are related, sort of in a cosmic sense, with the work of Chantal Akerman, and I think it just speaks to the Fatimata's natural sensitivity and immediate ability to frame in a certain way that makes her images extremely pleasant for Claire to edit. And these are some of the more interesting things that happened in the process of this film.
Were there other kids that surprised you with what the sort of the images they were bringing back that maybe took things beyond what you expected?
I mean, pretty much everything that's in the film. I think when we received this material, I watched it a first time immediately. We watched it with the group, and we had discussions. And then, when the editing of the film began in earnest, watching them again with Claire, you just sort of start noticing what is truly resonating with your own sensitivity as a filmmaker, as your own sensitivity as a viewer, and pretty much anything that's in the film is there because we felt it had some strength, that the image held our attention in some way, touched us in some very emotional way or sometimes cerebral way. But it could be Alyssa's ability at the end of the film to sort of have this diaristic practice where she's talking to us, the group, about her new life in the private school and what it's like to have gone, to have moved on from this public school, and what she misses and the melancholy she has and how she stages this with the music in the background. It's really quite something. I think all of these images were very surprising to me, and that's what helped. That's what made the project beautiful to participate in.
When did the editing process sort of begin in earnest? If you're shooting across 4 years, are you looking at that footage editing early on? Do you start later?
So there were several stages. And my initial intent was to make this in the form of a series, like a TV series, sort of 4 years, 2 episodes a year. We would have like a mini series of 8 episodes. And initially, this is what we started to do. We started to edit like 50-minute modules twice a year for the first year and a half. And we showed these to the group. We even showed them in an exhibition I did in Germany. We showed them in a festival in France as work in progress pieces. And so this meant that basically after the first year, the group had already seen what edited images look like and what this material was becoming. And I think this was very important because what happened later on is that we decided that the episode was not a good way to go. I stopped editing them and we threw everything out. And the last year, at the midway through the final of the 4 years, I went back to work on the edit with Claire. and we went back to the first footage. Like we went back to reviewing everything from the first minute to the last minute of what they had shot and what we had shot, while I was continuing to film the end of the project. And we made we had a very different process at that point. But it was informed by the fact that the group had seen these earlier forms, had seen these edited versions, and I think this modified their way of thinking about the project, and because they were seeing what it would look like when it was edited, and I think they were sort of gaining sort of confidence that this was going to be, you know, an interesting and serious looking film. And I think it informed their way of storytelling and of holding the camera and thinking about what it is that they were filming. And I guess what's implied in your question is, how did we specifically work in the editing room? Because the project is such a collaborative process in terms of filming, in terms of who's writing the film, who is shooting the images for the film. The editing was a much more intimate process that involved Claire and myself, because I don't think that editing is a collective, is a process that you can do in a collaborative and collective way. I think the decisions in editing are very much about how the material resonates with a filmmaker and an editor in a very specific context. And this context, I think, is very important to nurture, to, in a way, protect from other influences, you know. And so the film is definitely a fundamentally collaborative project in many of its stages, but not the editing. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what allowed us to make certain, you know, somewhat radical decisions in the editing process that the group would not have made, simply speaking. Because the group would have been interested in, you know, making sure that different things were in the film, because different kids had worked on different things, and they would have wanted this to be in the film. And this is where there's a sort of a more difficult artistic decision to make, which is to say that this is going to be a cut that I make with Claire. And then when we shared it back with them, the discussion continues, and this is something that was very well accepted. Mm-hmm. And that possibly revealed certain things about what it is that they were doing that made them understand very intuitively that this final form is an interesting and honest reflection of what it is that they made over the course of 4 years together.
I'd like to turn to some of the conversations that happen in the film. The kids have these just extraordinarily rich, in-depth conversations about identity and race and colonialism. I just wondered, like, did you get the feeling that these were conversations they were having amongst themselves off camera? Was this a space where they could bring these ideas that perhaps they'd been thinking about on their own? And how did they come into these spaces? Sort of how did that happen?
Well, the world sort of came crashing into our project 2 months in, because you know, the attacks that took place in November 13th, 2015, so a couple months after the beginning of the project, are really of a scale of what 9/11 was, you know, in New York. So, and they occurred in the neighborhoods that were surrounding the school, and these events had a direct impact on the life of the kids and their families, for many of the reasons that are discussed in the film, because most of the kids in the film come from Muslim families, and because the stigmatization that amplified in 2015 was a huge part of their young lives. At the age 11, the world really kind of came crashing down on them. So these first discussions that we have 2 months into the process, we didn't really have a choice but to have them. And it set a very grave tone in a way. It set a habit of having serious conversations. And this, I would say, is something that certainly gave an intonation for the rest of the process. Something that I also encouraged, because you know, there's a film by Jean-Luc Godard and Anne-Marie Mieville, or rather there's 13 short films that they made for French television in the 1980s. That's called France Tour des Tours, Deux Enfants, and it's a portrait of France through the filming of these two kids who are a little bit younger. I think they're 7 or 9. And the film is obviously very wonderful, and it's similar in many ways, but very different in many ways. But one of the things that I learned from the Godard film is that if you ask serious questions to kids, you will get very serious answers. And Godard certainly asks them very philosophical questions, to which they give very philosophical answers. The difference is that Godard's structure is a somewhat, as is a lot of his filmmaking, is somewhat authoritarian structure, where he essentially places himself in the position of the teacher interrogating the kids, and the kids respond to this interrogation, but it remains a sort of a very top-down system of question answer. And I did not want to reproduce a system of question answer. As much as possible, I wanted the group to generate the discussion, and I didn't want my role to be assimilated to that of a teacher, asking questions. So, but I very much took to heart this idea that that we could have very serious questions, discussions together. And so, once the questions related to terrorism sort of became less urgent, there was the presidential elections that came up, and obviously the presidential elections means, watching the media give insane amounts of coverage to, the far right party, and as you did with, Donald Trump, essentially as a media phenomenon gone, that sort of breaks into the real world in a way that is that's quite upsetting to everybody and becomes a subject of conversation. This happens also. So the kids talked about this, and then as time went on, their presence in the world makes it impossible not to have a political relationship to the world, because of where they live, because of who they are. And so it continues. So possibly, if the world had not barged into our project in the first year when they were 11, we probably would not have talked as much about politics. But by the time they were 13, 14, there's no question that this would be a subject matter, because it's a subject matter in their lives, either in an explicit or in an implicit way. But many of the conversations that they have in the hallways or in the schoolyard, either explicitly or implicitly, are about race, are about relations between groups within the school, between the very complex backgrounds, individual backgrounds of the different students. And so this naturally comes into the film as well.
Some of the more fascinating conversations are these points of conflict between the kids and these disagreements that they have. Was that something that was a theme in their relationships? Was it mostly a sort of collegial? I mean, even within those conversations, there's a kind of, joviality to it, perhaps. But how did they sort of find these issues? Was there some, perhaps a conflict off camera or anything like that?
Well, I don't know how it is in an American middle school, but I think in a French middle school, 80% of what the kids do in the hallway is insult each other and make jokes. And it's a playful, it's a playful battle, but it's constant. I think it's an age where you express yourself either in your, gender relations or finding your place in the world through a tempestuous, tumultuous conflict that is nonstop with your friends, with your enemies, with the girls, with the boys, with the teacher. It's a zone of conflict. So the question is, how do you channel this into a discussion where, the level of insults traded is lowered to a point where you can actually get to the issues that are lying beneath this aggressivity. But I think it's very playful, and it's not, most of the time there's no bad intentions, but it is a very conflictual environment. I mean, middle schools are very conflictual environments. And in the case of this group, there's a lot of very entrenched distinctions that are the object of these conversations: boys, girls, obviously racial questions, which are more complex because they have to do with, North African versus Sub-Saharan African descendants, Christian versus Muslim affiliations that cross both ways. In sub-Saharan African countries, there are going to be the kids that come from Muslim families, other that come from Christian families. There's more and more evangelical influences in these neighborhoods. So these that permeate through all racial groups. So there's some very strange affiliations, affinities, rivalries, and so that's a big part of what happens. And then you map onto this, obviously, the boys and the girls. It's these things are happening, and so these are preoccupations, and they nourish. And then I think they get matched to the meta conversations that are happening in the culture at large, that are happening on television, that are happening on the news. Around issues of police brutality, around issues of immigration policies, around issues of this social discrimination, or so the question was, how do we organize this in a way that's not school teaching, but that's not a mudslinging the festival of banter, but try to essentially to say things much simpler, so that people speak one at a time and not all at the same time, so that we can do something with this when we're at the editing room.
Great.
That was my job.
And I think you did an amazing job. We have a few questions that we took from the internet that I'd like to turn to now. One was, were there filmmaking techniques that the kids used that you liked, that you perhaps even thought about bringing into your own practice? And how maybe did they develop in their technique over time?
Fatimata's use of, idea of placing the camera in front of the television, towards the room, away from the television, while the family watches the television, I think is genius. I mean, that's just like, that's a genius idea, because, if you just think about it from like a theoretical, in a theoretical filmmaking manner, it's very complex shot that she's established. That the people in the room are watching the television is off camera, but the sound of the television is on. So you have a very clear understanding, or a partial understanding, of what it is that they're watching, which is a window onto the mediascape of the culture. And at the same time, it's a source of interaction. The kids are dancing to stuff that they're seeing on the television. They're commenting on the television. So you can spend a bunch of time doing a semiotician's analysis of that setup, and it's quite rich. But on the whole, I also was very appreciative of their theoretical understanding of the relationship between sound and image. This was a big part of the middle of the film. And the way that came about was that when Lena leaves, because her mother gets a job in La Réunion, a little island of French territory off the coast of Madagascar, we give her a little camera so that she can continue to send news home, and that accelerates the idea of providing them, several of them, with or providing small cameras that the group can borrow and bring home. And that's why we decide to go to the sea, because Lena's been sending us these pictures of the Indian Ocean, and we're just stuck there in this room, and it's driving us crazy for 2 years. And so we decide to burn the last of our budget by renting a bus and going to the sea for a week. And then thinking, well, what are we going to do if we go to the sea? And I think a couple of weeks before, occasionally we would watch films together. And I like to show them different kinds of films, but one filmmaker that I would frequently show them is Jean Rouch, and specifically a film, an ethnographic film called Mami Wata, which is a film about the spirits in the sea spirits and their influence on the fishing communities in the Niger in West Africa. And while we were watching the film, I think it's Bintou who said, what's interesting is that the sound and the image are not the same in this film. And what she means is that, Rouch frequently didn't use direct sound. He filmed with the silent 16 camera, and then he would do like post-synchronized voices or do separate sort of sound recordings, and then just collage everything in the editing room. But Bintou was very interested in this idea that, you know, what happens when sound and image are not sync, because essentially for her, cinema or film is, in general, or images are always about the synchronicity of sound and image, and suddenly here it's not synchronous. And they literally in real time just sort of took apart, you know, the methodology that is important in Rouche's filmmaking. And that's how we decided, well, what happens if when we take the bus to go to the sea, we forget the sound is left behind. And so then, you know, I organized a friend of mine who's a Foley artist to wait for us at the seafront with these suitcases full of Foley tools. And then we started sort of making the sounds of the seagulls, and then from there on, it just set the tone for this exploration of image and sound, and the dissociation of image and sound in the film. But for this was an important part of sort of having these somewhat complex theoretical discussions, but to do them in a very sort of playful and intuitive manner with the group.
Mm-hmm. The next question we have is a general question. How much footage did the kids shoot? I mean, how many hours of their own footage did you have to go through?
You know, surprisingly, they shot in a far more economical way than the adults in the room did. I have far more images, which were, you know, dreadfully boring to go through, shot by my, you know, adult filmmakers, or the camera people. When they brought the cameras back from their week or two at home, they were surprisingly efficient. You know, Fatimata would bring back 45 minutes of footage, 30 minutes of absolute beauty, and then maybe like a little bit of some shots that weren't necessarily so wonderful. But I think they were very to the point, very, you know, they did what they had to do, and they brought it back. So I don't usually have a habit of counting hours of footage, but I don't think it was monumental. I mean, even though it's a 4-year project, I don't like to do films with too much footage. I hate watching hundreds of hours of footage. I mean, to me, it's just the worst part of filmmaking. So I usually make films that have a fairly short amount of rushes, and then so I don't know, but I don't know exactly how much, but it's not that much. And I know that the most boring part was not what the students filmed, it was what the adults filmed.
And this seems like a great sort of wrap-up question. I guess the kids are ending up high school now, have maybe just graduated or just about to graduate. Are you keeping up with any of them? How are they doing now? Yeah, what's the state of that group?
So I keep up with a lot of them, not all of them. Some of them have sort of disappeared into thin air, but I'd say half of them I'm very much in touch with. They come over to my house as often as possible, a bit less now because of the COVID situation. But some of them still come and borrow cameras and film stuff. Fatimata does a lot. She's in a professional a vocational high school specializing in film and video. There's been rumors that we're working on a new film, although I can't confirm or deny those rumors. But they're doing well, you know. A lot of them have come to festivals. All of them have come to festivals. We generally have been to each festival with 2 students, and so they've had interactions with audiences, and that's been really possibly the most fun we've had, is to really have them sort of interact with audiences in other countries. And you know, we were supposed to come to New York with Lena, and obviously that's a huge disappointment. But I think what was incredibly interesting to them was that the biggest surprise for them is that people care. You know, when we were in Locarno for the premiere of the film with David and Giannis, after the first screening ever of the film, Giannis took the microphone, and you know, he's very loquacious. He's usually very you know, his words come out easy with him, and but he was a bit speechless because here there were this theater with hundreds of people, and he asked a question to the audience. He said, you know, did anybody make you come here? Like, was this an assigned, you have to come to see this film? And he couldn't, it was hard for him to figure out that like people had voluntarily come to see the film, that they had like stood in line, bought a ticket, chosen to come and see this film. You know, we had seen the Tarantino film on the Piazza Grande the previous night, the most recent Tarantino film. So he had witnessed thousands of people watching Tarantino, and the next day, you know, a few hundred people came to see his film, and he was amazed by that. He was amazed that anybody cares. And I think that this is both, you know, a comment about what it means to be a kid in France these days, and particularly in these neighborhoods, where you're feeling like you're not part of the story. You're not the story that people are interested in. And when people are interested in this story, when the media is interested in this story, it's to talk about gang violence, it's to talk about, you know, riots, it's to talk about poverty, and none of this is central to their lives the way, you know, what the film shows is what is actually central to their lives. And it's not gang violence, and it's not drugs, and it's not, you know, it's everything else. And so I think they become so used to the way in which their neighborhood is portrayed on television, they're so used to it, that they're kind of surprised when they find that people are interested in other stories than those stories that you see on television, you know? And so, so I think that was super important. And I think that has kept us united in a way that will probably have some duration, because I think that was an important collective experience, and that will probably be the thing that will last the longest. This idea that, you know, these mundane small events of their lives are a story that somebody else might care about.
Well, that seems like an incredible note to end on. Éric, I want to thank you again so much for coming here and virtually being with us today for this Q&A and sharing your film with us. And please send our thanks back to all of the kids as well for their incredible work on this project. Un Film Dramatique is ongoing in our virtual cinema, so please spread the word about this incredible film. But, you know, pass around. We want as many people to see it as possible. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bam. And I hope to be there in person sometime in the near future. Bye-bye.